Hello, welcome to Spread Book Joy. Today I want to talk to you about the Britney Spears autobiography, The Woman in Me. If you're new to the channel, I'm Jack, and if you're not new, welcome back. And I suppose I should preface this review or recommendation video by saying my sort of history of Britney Spears fandom, I suppose. I'm not a huge Britney Spears fan, I'm not like a diehard Britney fan, but I always really liked her music. It first came out in the late 90s, I was in my early 20s, and I really liked her first album, and I bought that, and I still have the CD over there. Yeah, I really enjoyed Britney's music. I liked her image, I liked her style, I thought she was pretty cool. I went to see her in the late 2000s when she did her circus tour, I think it was called, but I'll talk about that in a moment when I go through the book, because that comes up in the autobiography quite a bit. But the reason I'm saying all of this is because I think it helps to understand my perspective as to why I would recommend this book. It's not the best written book, it's ghost written, it's very basic, it's not, you're not going to expect any sort of amazing writing or prose or expression within this book. But what I really appreciated about it was a really honest memoir of a very traumatic time in this woman's life, and we have never really heard from Britney properly, particularly in the last 15 years or so, since she had a 13-year conservatorship, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. But we've never really had this honest perspective of her life before, and she's someone who grew up in the public eye, and I also find child stardom really fascinating. Last year I read the autobiography, which I'm Glad My Mum Is Dead, which was I can't remember the child star who did that because I didn't really know of her before I read the autobiography, but that is a really well written book about her life and her toxic relationship with her mother and everything else. And these things of course come up in the Britney autobiography. So the reason I want to talk about it, though, I think whilst it's not the most well-written book, it's very accessible, it's very easily readable, it's very short, and I think it's the sort of book that people who don't always read will pick up this book, because it's a tell-all, it's her life, and we're hearing from her at last in a real way. So we finally find out about Britney's life back before she was famous. So the biography charts Britney's life and the history of her family. So it talks about her life before she was famous, growing up with the parents that she grew up with. Her father was an alcoholic, very controlling, and her mother and Britney had a good relationship to start with, which petered out as she got older. But she also talks about the history of mental illness within her family, particularly her grandmother, her paternal grandmother, her father's mother. She died by suicide after many years of deep depression following the loss of a child. Her grandfather had her grandmother committed, and it just seems that this is a theme that continues within the Spears family, particularly to Britney, as her story goes on. So we're all quite familiar with Britney Spears' rise to fame. In 1998, she was 15 when her very first album and first single came out, and she was sort of catapulted into global superstardom. I mean, she was like the biggest star on the planet at the time, which is a lot to put on some very young shoulders. Within the autobiography, she also talks about her relationship with Justin Timberlake. He does not come out well in this book. That's probably been the most publicised part of this autobiography, is the revelation that Britney had an abortion while she was with Justin. I also didn't realise at the time that she was living with Justin Timberlake. They were a couple, but they were also living together. They were cohabiting, as much as two people who are constantly touring can cohabit. So they had a very serious relationship, and it was the breakdown of that relationship which led to her deterioration of her mental health. When people have poor mental health, and especially if they're in the public eye like Britney was, then there are really complex reasons as to why this person may suffer a breakdown, and she suffered a public breakdown. I remember watching that on the news at the time, and I actually cried because I thought it was a really horrific tragedy that someone so young could have been brought to this point that they're having a complete breakdown and it's being televised. And it just felt so intrusive and shocking to me at that time. And Britney talks about all of the build up to this, being chased by the paparazzi continually. They were trying to get pictures of her being a bad mother. She was constantly judged for being a bad mother because she was a young mother. She had two children quite close together. She was continually hounded and followed and harassed, and got to the point where she just couldn't take it anymore. Alongside this, her marriage to Kevin Federline, who is the husband of her children, was breaking down really publicly. And so here we have the story of a young woman who is continuously hounded by the press, continuously judged for her actions. She's being blamed for like being morally reprehensible and not being a good role model to young people. And then she's getting older, so she's no longer this quirky, sparky 16-year-old. She is a grown woman. She's in her mid-20s. She, at one point in her autobiography, says, "I didn't realise that I'd agreed to stay 17 for the rest of my life." And this is it. She's being punished for growing up, getting older. She's living her life in a very public, under the spotlight, and yes, it comes with a lot of privilege, fame, because she's got, you know, a really huge fortune out of it. So in terms of her finances, she was set up for life, but at what cost? Then on top of that, we have the added scandal that her father was awarded a conservatorship. People who are not deemed to be able to take care of themselves are awarded, people will be awarded a conservatorship, which means they take over their life, they take over the control of their finances, of their medication, of any decision making. I believe someone under a conservatorship is not considered well enough to be able to even vote, and she worked under this conservatorship for her father, and she basically carried on performing, carried on going on tour. Britney Spears, the product, was wheeled out to audiences all around the world, and I was one of them because I went to see her in 2009 at the Circus Tour, and I remember remarking to a friend of mine at the time, I'd never seen her live before, but it felt really robotic. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, it's like they've got her out of a box and wound her up and put her on the stage. It felt like there was no oomph to that performance for me, and I felt like it really didn't sit right. It felt like we were watching someone who was just performing by numbers and taking no pleasure in it. And when you read her autobiography, that's exactly what was happening. So under her conservatorship, if she questioned any decisions that were being made about her tours, about her performances, they would say, perhaps you need to go to therapy, or they would commit her for a while to an institution. And basically, yes, she was imprisoned in an institution if she didn't go along with everything that was happening to her. So this is a really shocking book in many, many ways, and it highlights the gaslighting that this girl went through, the spotlight and scrutiny that young women, particularly when they become mothers, are under. You are damned if you're too sweet and nice. You're damned if you're considered to be too real and trashy. You're continually judged by everybody around you, and that pressure must have been absolutely immense. So we find out a bit more about the Free Britney movement, which was started 4 or 5 years ago by her fans who believed that she was being trapped within this conservatorship. And a lot of people were mocking this movement for quite some time, the Free Britney movement, but as it turns out, it was knowing that people were out there trying to help her and supporting her to get out of the conservatorship that forced her into doing something about it, that pushed her or supported her into doing something about it. Yeah, it was a really fascinating autobiography, and I found it, as someone who has followed Britney's career, really eye-opening and really honest. I think it's really accessible, and it carries a lot of really important messages for women, young women and girls, about their power, how they perceive themselves, how they can stand up for themselves, and the things that the media are responsible for in terms of this poor woman's life and her mental health falling apart. Now, added to this, I also recently watched the Robbie Williams documentary on Netflix. I was a huge, and still am a huge, Take That fan, but I was never a big Robbie fan. I think once he left Take That, even though he was my favourite in Take That, once he left Take That, I wasn't really a fan of Robbie Williams. I found him to be, I thought he was arrogant, he was unpleasant, beheaded, all those things that he was portrayed in the media. And I watched his documentary, and in the documentary they show him footage from behind the scenes of his entire career. And again, it struck me, he's someone who came to fame very young. He joined Take That when he was just turning 16, and when they really hit the big time, he was 18 years old, and he has grown up in this spotlight, much like Britney Spears, and he turned to alcohol and drugs very early on to cope with everything. Obviously in the beginning it's like this element of partying, he's a teenager, he's a pop star, he's living that kind of life, but he was obviously really insecure. He was the youngest in his band, and then you watch this documentary and yet again we see a young person being absolutely torn apart by the media at the time. So this was the British press in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they completely tore him apart and tore apart his work. So I think I've been watching a lot about that recently, and I've recently listened to a podcast about Amy Winehouse, and I love Amy Winehouse as well. The film Amy, if you've never watched it, you have to watch it, but it's with tissues. It's really, really sad. But she is someone who, unlike Amy Winehouse, Robbie Williams is still here today because he found a secure relationship. He went to rehab. He's managed to build a great life for himself, and he can reflect on all of this now. And him watching the footage of himself when he was younger, it was just really heartbreaking actually to see someone watching their younger selves falling apart. But he's made it out the other side, and so has Britney. So there's positives to these stories. If you compare it to the story of Amy Winehouse, who sadly didn't make it, she also was hounded by the press. And in the podcast I listened to, which I'll link in the description box below, which is You're Wrong About, which is a great podcast, they talk about the fact that she was made the butt of so many jokes in the media, and quite nasty ones as well. And they play some of the clips from people at the time who talked about her awards shows and just constantly putting her down. And this is a young woman who eventually, her addictions did kill her, and she was lost far too soon. So I'm kind of like, at the moment I'm kind of reading a lot about famous people who I admired at the time and I was a fan of for a lot of their career, and they're coming out with the honest recount of their life, and I just found it really, really fascinating, and particularly damning about the media of the time. Though we do know that, don't we? We know it was the time of News of the World and Heat magazine and all these gossip magazines, and we look back on it now, and personally I look back on all of that and I just think, what were we feeding this monster, this kind of paparazzi monster? It's all around the same time as Princess Diana had not long been killed, being chased by paparazzi in Paris. And You're Wrong About also has a really good episode, a series of episodes where they go through Jessica Simpson's autobiography, and they talk about her, and she had a lot of parallels with Britney Spears at the time and the issues that she was having and the way she was portrayed. And she was famously someone who was saving herself for marriage, and she was ripped apart for that a lot in the press. Britney also discusses the fact that when she says, I didn't realise I'd have to stay 17 for the rest of my life, or I'd agreed to stay 17 for the rest of my life, the fact that her body and her physical state were continually scrutinised, talked about, questioned. She was asked all sorts of really inappropriate questions about her body, her boobs, her everything. And then when she had children and then she was overweight, she was torn apart for not looking as trim and toned as she had done, but she just had 2 babies. Yeah, the whole thing just shone a huge spotlight on the misogyny that was rife in the media at the time. But you'll see as well in the Robbie Williams documentary where his physical appearance is pulled apart by the press. Gary Barlow at the time as well, he was being called fat all the time and continually ripped apart for his appearance to the point where he became bulimic. So yeah, terrible times thinking back to those late 90s, early noughties paparazzi days. They were really horrific, and I don't think they're quite a huge amount better than they were in terms of their responsibility towards people and their mental health when they're portraying famous people, particularly famous young people. But I think we've moved on a little bit since then. When you look back on it, it's just horrific, but really, really fascinating. I've also started reading a really good book called Reach for the Stars, which is about late 90s, early 2000s pop. It's about 10 years in the UK, starting off with the Spice Girls and then going through till about 2006. So that's also a bit of a tell-all biography for these supposedly squeaky clean pop stars with their images and the hell they went through with trying to portray themselves as these clean-cut, clean living, ideal idols, like these pop idols. So yeah, it's a really interesting time. So if you're interested in any of that, I'd recommend the podcast I mentioned, which I'll link in the description box below, the Robbie Williams documentary, definitely, and this book Reach for the Stars, which is an oral history of British pop from 1996 to 2006. Pretty good. If you're a Spice Girls fan as well, which I wasn't a huge Spice Girls fan, I did like some of their stuff, but if you're a Spice Girls fan, it's well worth reading. If you have watched any of these things or read any of them, I haven't yet watched the David Beckham documentary, which is about the same time, but I'm going to. But yeah, if you have read any of these things or watched anything you want to comment on, let me know what you think of them in the description box below, and hopefully I'll see you again here soon. Bye.